This is a podcast about our lived experience, which unfortunately includes infant death and subsequent mental health struggles. Please take good care of yourself and only listen if this content feels safe for you right now. We'll still be here when you're ready.
Hi, I'm Judith.
And I'm Alina. We both lost babies to SIDS in winter 2021.
In the throes of grief, I reached out to a stranger on the internet and our friendship was born.
In the years since, we've been working hard to survive, rebuild, and navigate the continual challenges that have come our way, including divorce,
Job loss,
dating while bereaved,
moving multiple times,
health scares,
pregnancy and parenting a living child,
starting new jobs, and so much more.
We are tired.
Happily ever after is out of the question for us, but this podcast documents our journeys to happier ever after because we believe life after loss is worth living.
So join us as we laugh, cry until we laugh.
Welcome to As Long as I'm Living podcast.
We're so glad you're here.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Well, I'm so excited.
Thank you.
And we're really excited to have you here. We're going to start rolling. I normally give like a little introduction to our guests, or Alina does. So I'm going to do my best, but you're going to correct me and just do your own introduction if I mess it up. Okay, so today on the podcast, we have a special guest, Rabbi Antine. And Rabbi Antine's a pulpit rabbi to a big congregation. And the reason that we're having him on the podcast today is because I had seen him at a community event a couple months ago, or a week, I don't know, some time ago. And I was talking to him about his hobbies, and he told me he like goes mountain biking and I don't know, maybe once he went camping, something like that. And he said, "Do you have any hobbies?" And I said, I have a podcast, which always begs the question, like, what's your podcast about? And then I always like kind of pause for a minute and I say, oh, baby loss, grief, like trauma. And he said, oh, that's such an interesting topic. I love that topic.
There are two types of people in this world. So people who hear that and like recoil in horror, and people who lean forward and are like, wow, that's so interesting. And you're clearly the latter.
And you said, you're like, oh, I also study grief and loss. And I think I asked you something like, did you lose someone? And you're like, no, I love it. So I think at that point, I realized that we definitely need to have you on, especially because we have talked about religion in general, but we've actually never had a clergy member. So I think this is going to be a really interesting topic. And I would love to hear from you. I mean, if you want to introduce yourself in another way, go for it. But I'd love to hear from you, why is grief and loss interesting to you? And then we can kind of take it from there.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, thank you. It's a real honor to be here, and it's an honor to be your first clergy person on the podcast. And I actually did listen to some of your episodes, and they were really moving. So I'm really grateful that I had the opportunity to do that. So yeah, and get to know you guys a little bit, and that was really nice. So the reason why I'm very interested in the topic, I guess the most basic answer is just because it's part of my profession. I mean, being a rabbi, especially of a suburban synagogue, we have a very wide range of families, including a lot of young families as well. But we definitely have our share of people who are elderly and members who are middle-aged, who have a lot of parents who are passing on and dying. So a lot of my job is guiding people through process of death and mourning, and doing it in a Jewish way. And not only that, a lot of my job from a pastoral perspective actually revolves around what we call in Hebrew Bikor Cholim, which means visiting the sick. And especially in recent years, I've really dedicated a lot of my time and energy and focus to that particular aspect of the rabbinate. So there are a number of people in my synagogue who are homebound, who are elderly or sick, and I used to just, every once in a while I would set up a time to meet with them and go visit them. And now I recently actually just do it like have something on my calendar every week. There are probably about 4 or 5, maybe about 6 people who I just visit every single week. So now at this point, I've actually really sat with a number of people as they were going through the dying process and getting sicker, and been there with their families. And then, of course, when they die, leading them through all the ritual aspects, which I'm happy to talk more about if that's something of interest.
Oh, we will get there for sure. That's definitely interesting to me.
yeah, and then guiding the families through that process of the death and the dying and the rituals around burial and the funeral. And then we have a very complex process of mourning rituals that follow that. And I would say it's a pretty big part of my job. Maybe even 15-20% of my job, I would say is about that. So definitely something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And that's.
Do you think other rabbis think of it as 15 to 20% of their job, or are you unique in that where you take that part of your job really seriously?
I think it depends on the synagogue and the demographic makeup of the synagogue. Some rabbis have synagogues that are full of a lot, mostly young families or only young families. Our synagogue is more of a legacy synagogue. It's 120 years old. So we have members who have been here for a long time, and we have lots of people who are going through that stage of their life. So that's become a big part. And we're blessed to have more than one clergy member. We have an assistant rabbi who spends a lot of time, more of his time, I would say, on the younger families and younger kids. I also am involved in that, but so I find myself gravitating towards old people, and in general, I that's also just what I'm interested. I love those conversations. One of the highlights of my week every week is there's a number of years ago. There's a member of my synagogue who has advanced dementia, and it actually was very sad watching him regress, because this was a person who came every single morning to the morning prayer service. And was a very active part of it, and then retired. And then within a few months after retiring, really started declining and had dementia. And then his wife called me up once, and she said, can I give my tefillin? Tefillin it's a Hebrew word. It's like these leather boxes that have sections of the.
I don't even think this is helping. I don't even.
I'm digging myself into it. Anyways, it's a ritual item that we use during prayer, which I love, but it's hard to explain to other people. So his wife said to me, I've got this pair of tefillin. He can't wear them. He doesn't know how to put them on anymore. He doesn't know how to do it. And can I give them to my grandson who's having his bar mitzvah? And that's when you start wearing them. And I said, well, you can technically give them to your grandson, but why should he stop wearing them? And she's like, well, he can't put them on. So I said, you know what? I'm going to put together a group of people, and I was one of them. And we're going to come once a week, and we're going to put them on and talk to him and pray with him. And just watching this person who had really advanced dementia do the prayers with him, and him light up at certain sentences and all of a sudden remember, and he was alive in a very, very deep and powerful way. It just had a huge impact on me watching that. He was the first person that I set up these weekly visits with. And then I started doing more and more of that. So in answering your question, that it has to do with the demographics of my synagogue. And now I'm doing that with a number of people.
That's a perfect segue, because I wanted to ask you, this is the first question I want to ask you. First, let's just say, Alina, do you spend time with rabbis? No, this might be the first rabbi.
This is probably the first rabbi that I'm interacting closely with. Yeah. So my background is I am not religious at all. I grew up with no religion at all, and I still have no religion at all. And Judith, for our listeners, you probably already know Judith is Jewish. Rabbi Antine already knows Judith is Jewish. So I actually I feel like our podcast, this is going to probably sound weird, but I feel like we're unique because a lot of podcasts have a very Christian, and a lot of loss and grief podcasts wind up, at least in the United States, with a very kind of Christian bent to it. We get a lot of requests for people to come on to talk about, Jesus and healing. And I think there's a lot there. But I'm glad, I feel honored to have the first clergy person be someone from a faith that is underrepresented, in my view. I think I would love to have more clergy people on, but I'm so happy you're the first, Rabbi Antine, and I can't wait to hear about the way that Jewish people approach death, because I think it's incredible. You guys really do it right.
Okay, so
in my view.
My first question is, what do you feel is faith or Judaism, however you want to answer this question, role in grief, in loss, in dying? What is the role that it's supposed to play in its ideal form?
Okay, well, I mean, I don't know if I would call this faith. I would say this is more the Judaism part, not necessarily the faith part.
Yeah.
I would say almost even more leaning towards Jewish community aspect of it. So much of the mourning process, what it does is it concretizes mourning rituals and mourning process. Like people, especially outsiders, people who are not going through what the mourners or the grievers are going through, they have no idea what to say, when to say it, when to come, where to show up, and having like a set book and a set of guidelines, which helps everybody. It kind of creates a framework both for the mourner and the griever, but also for the community to come in and assist. And it starts from the moment of death. It starts from the rituals, even around how we take care of the dead person, of the dead body, the body, how we take care of them in a beautiful, dignified way. There's a whole burial society that takes care of that, and it's something which is very powerful. To the funeral and how community members come during the week of Shiva, during the 7 days after the funeral. There are prayer services in people's homes, and it's about faith. It's certainly about praying to God, but it's really more about people coming there and offering the support and the strength and the communal bonds, and you're not alone. And yes, every mourner does it differently, and that's where sometimes some of the challenges come up. Sometimes a mourner will say to me, well, what if I don't want to have so many people around then? I'm really grieving. And so I'll tell them, look, these rules are really designed for you to help you out. So you can carve out an hour or two of people coming and visit, and the rest of the time, you can be by yourself, or you can figure out ways to do it that work for you. But the point is, the structure is there.
Yeah, and I'll say, as someone who did not have any religious component to her grief, or there was a real lack of structure, and I think everyone around me, who also none of them are particularly religious, there was definitely a lot of they did a really good job with what they had, but they didn't have a guidebook or a set of instructions for what to do. We didn't have rituals in the same way that you all do. So there was no structure to the day. Like, on this day we do this. For this week we do this. There just wasn't that. And even the community aspect too. I know, Judith, you had a meal train, right? I had friends who brought food. I had family who brought food, but there was no organized WhatsApp chat that was okay, you're going to bring food on this day. You're going to bring food on this day. You're going to bring food on this day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'm laughing because when I think it was the first anniversary of Aiden's death, I added Alina to some WhatsApp group, and you know how we love our WhatsApp groups that all my friends were in, and Alina was completely overwhelmed by the coordination and the involvement and the people, and
but it was really special. So I got invited to the Aiden's Yortzeit meal train group, and it felt so good to be able to participate in that. And then, of course, yes, I was definitely overwhelmed with a lot of other things that I had no concept for what it was. I kept Googling translations of what's this, what's that.
There was a structure, even to the Yortzeit. There's some sort of day and structure, and people kind of know what to do.
And listeners, Yortzeit is the Hebrew death anniversary. I'm just realizing I said that because I know what that is now, but many of you might not know. But it's the death anniversary.
One thing that you've commented on is that you really love the Judaism's use of candles.
Yes, I really love that.
And the Yortzeit candle, which I didn't have a question related to that, but that's something that I never really thought about. But Alina picked up, and now she lights candles. Wait, I'll tell you this one story. Okay, Rabbi Antine, Alina came to my house, and she was there for Friday night for Shabbos. And so I was lighting candles, and she's like, I want to light candles for my family. So I said, sure. How many do you want? And she was like, I need 4. I need one for me. I have one in my family, one for me, one for Quinn, that's her son, and then for my cats.
Exactly. I was like, oh, is that not what you do?
Exactly.
Okay, that's the side point. But the question I wanted to ask is, can you speak a little bit about the difference between, is there a difference in Judaism when you're mourning a child or a baby versus mourning an adult? And I know that you don't have a lot of experience with child loss, but could you speak to, as a pulpit member, how are you supposed to know what to do in these tragic instances that aren't
Right.
the normal cycle of life.
Right. Not even necessarily child, although obviously
Not even child.
even
Let's
like, let's say a
say-
25-year-old is hit by a drunk driver or
something like that. Yeah.
Right.
Speak to those
Right.
differences.
Yeah. So obviously, so we have the standard rituals of mourning, and I guess you could say that they were kind of conceived for people who live whatever a regular life is, whatever that's supposed to mean.
Full life, die of old age. What we all want.
But yeah, I mean, it's actually kind of interesting and complicated. It happens to be that a few weeks ago, a colleague, it wasn't even someone in my synagogue, but a colleague of mine was dealing with a case with a miscarriage, and they were asking me about it, and I was helping them looking it up and doing some of the research. So yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and it's actually, I think, quite painful for some people, because a lot of the standard rituals, like the legal obligations of mourning, like we have laws of kosher, keep what we eat, what we do for Shabbat, but we have a whole set of laws of mourning, and the laws of mourning and grief, they don't apply to miscarriages. In fact, they typically don't apply until even for a stillborn, and they wouldn't apply unless the child lives for at least a month after the birth. And so if there's a miscarriage or even an infant death, under 1 month, in typical Jewish legal language, we would say that child, you don't have to sit Shiva. You don't have to do the complex mourning rituals around them. And I know that the way that I've understood it, and I did do a little bit of reading on this, it turns out that some of the theories that are offered is that in those days when a lot of these laws were being developed, infant mortality rates were very high, and high rates of miscarriages and things like that. And the idea of parents being forced or obligated to follow all of these rituals would have been perhaps
a burden
that they didn't want. And maybe they did want to just, not do it. And so it was actually quite common for, if there'd be a miscarriage or even a stillborn or a child that didn't make it to a month, they would just hand the baby over to the burial society, and they wouldn't even go to the funeral at all. There wouldn't be a funeral. And also there's a special place in the cemetery, on the edge of the cemetery, where they're buried. And lots of people did not participate in that. I actually do remember hearing something I'm just remembering this right now as we're speaking. I remember hearing something very powerful reflection from one of my rabbis, who said that this had in fact happened to him and his wife. They had, I don't remember what the circumstances were, either a very late term miscarriage or stillbirth. I'm not sure what it was, but they did follow that traditional approach, and they didn't even see the baby, and they didn't know anything about it. They didn't even know where the baby was buried. And years later, like 20 or 30 or 40 years later, they were just they felt something was missing, because they had not done that. That was still coming up for them. And they were able to do all of this research, and they were able to locate where it was. And they actually went back to find the place. Wow. And they said some prayers, and they got some closure around that. So that's actually a shift, I think, that's happening in the last 20 or 30 years in our community. You wouldn't want to take the approach where you just say, okay, I'm going to ignore this and move on. We can point to the idea that the rabbis were at least trying to give, and the tradition was trying to give parents a little more flexibility, because everybody does it differently.
And can I just speak as the outsider here? I want to ask the question. So what you're saying is that the laws are saying after a month, you're required to do these sets of rituals. So in other words, when they were saying under 1 month, you're not required to do this, were they saying you can't do this, or were they saying you are not required? And is that kind of the question that you were doing research on?
Major debates about that. So,
because I will say we have listeners and followers who are Jewish and observant, and who have had losses in the space you're talking about, and this has been a big pain point for them. Yeah. Either they don't know where their baby's buried, they regret going down that path, or they feel a lot of pain around their community not recognizing their loss, even if they had, a full-term stillbirth, or, as you're saying, a baby who was born alive and died subsequently. So
given that context, let me be as clear as possible. I believe 100% that parents have the right to grieve in the way they want to grieve. Even if it's not required, they have the right. We have examples like this in many other situations. Technically speaking, if a parent is adopted, they're not their biological parent, then there are technically in certain circumstances, they're not obligated to do the mourning. Or let's say somebody is a convert to Judaism, so their parents are not of the faith. They're not part of the Jewish, not because there isn't a loss, but just because these rituals were built around Jewish practice and the loss of Jewish relatives. So technically speaking, if someone's a convert, they don't have to do it. But I always advise people that just means they don't have to. If they feel like that wouldn't feel right for their parents, who are maybe Christian or some other faith, and they don't want to do that, then that's fine. But if they feel like their parents would be okay with it, and they are Jewish, and this is the way they want to mourn and grieve, then they're certainly allowed to. So I would say the same thing about these situations as well. Right. That if the parent wants to, they should be able to find the rituals that are meaningful for them. And that's the good thing is that there is already a structure there that they could tap into and use if it would be helpful.
And what do you view? I mean, I want to talk about something I actually haven't spoken about very much on this podcast at all. We did talk about it once, and when we did, I kind of landed on I don't know. I'm still wrestling with it, which this is not a conversation I've really had with very many people, but I'd love to talk a little bit about belief in God and how you see it changing when people have experienced a loss. And, this whole question of good things happen to bad people, bad things happen to good people. How do you view that question of tragedy happening and what to do with that in terms of belief in God and the relationship with God?
Yeah,
that's more of a conversation because I don't think you have an answer. Obviously, everyone's different. What do you see? Do you see it that people come out of it questioning their faith? Do you see that people become closer? What do you see?
I think a lot of it has to do with people's belief in God before and the nature of their belief in God. So if people believe in a personal God who's very active in every single aspect of life and really almost like the puppeteer controlling everything that's happening, then this leaves them with great challenges. I mentioned this rabbi who went back to find where their baby was buried. This is a very respected rabbi, and he even shared it publicly, that for months, maybe up to a year after it happened, he was not able to pray anymore. He was not able to pray. He was not able to pray to God. So I think that for some people, if they have that a certain sense that God should have done that and should have been able to be there to make things work in a different way, then they're going to feel very disappointed by God. But I think another approach, and this is really more of my approach, just to throw out another Hebrew term is hester panim, which means a lot of people believe that God, it literally means God, we're in a relationship with God where God is hidden in a certain sense, meaning we're not living during biblical times where we have these open miracles and God is hidden in a certain sense, and we have to find and seek and search for God. And then from a theological perspective, it sort of changes from the God who prevents any bad thing from happening more to the God who is with us when we're struggling. And then God becomes, again, there's Hebrew terms that I'll just use the English, but the term is, God says, I am with you in your pain. Meaning instead of it being the God who prevents the pain from happening to begin with, God is the source of strength during the painful moments. And I've had many conversations with other congregants, and I felt this myself too during challenging times, where my prayer actually becomes more intense and more opening up of my heart to God, because it's like God is there in order to support me. And oftentimes when we feel that there's no one else, there's languages in the Psalms that basically say, everyone has abandoned me, but God is still there. And there's this sense, there's a certain sense when nobody sees me, when no one can see my pain, when no one can understand what I'm going through, what someone's going through, God can always see it. Now you say, well, if God saw it, why didn't God stop it? Well, that's challenging, painful thought if people have that approach to God. And I know many people who do have that approach to God, and they have their ways of dealing with it. But if you start if you believe in a God who is not there for whatever theological reason to come and prevent these bad things from happening, which Jews and people of all faith have been dealing with that question of theodicy forever. But if you don't approach God from that perspective, then God becomes a source of strength and a source to turn to when you're actually struggling. And I think it could actually deepen your connection with God, if that's the God that you're trying to approach.
Judith, does that because that I think is actually pretty aligned with, I'll link back to our old episode where we talk about this. Crisis of faith is what it's called. You talked a lot about how your feelings about the various aspects of your faith changed. First of all, I guess I'll ask you, has your faith changed even since that episode, which was over a year ago? We recorded it.
Yeah.
And then also, does what Rabbi Antine just said, resonate with you? Because I'll say it does resonate with me. Even as someone who doesn't have a belief in God, that picture of God is one I can get more behind than the kind of grantor of all things, or stopper of bad things, or whatever.
I agree. I don't feel like I ever expected God to only do good. I think my relationship with God is not the challenge that I've really struggled with. I think I've always believed that there is a God. I think the part that I really that is more difficult for me is the trappings in which God was taught to me, I'll say, meaning all of the hold on, I want to get my words right for this.
Yeah.
I never assumed that only good would happen to me. I think I definitely had an approach that the rabbi is talking to when it came to God. But I do really struggle with this idea that God wants me to live a certain way. I think what I've realized now is that what I need is more important to me than what I think was taught in terms of what the rabbis might say that I need to live my life. To live my most fulfilled and best life, I need to find my own path that works for me, not the path that was told to me is prescribed to me. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
The issue I have is with the trappings, with the interpretation of what my faith has to look like, not with God itself. And I can separate the two in my head. I can still have a relationship with God without necessarily feeling like I am obligated to pray every day, or I'm obligated to dress a certain way, or I'm obligated, which I feel like was linked before in my head. Before, it definitely felt like if I did X, Y, and Z, then I would be living, I don't know, I guess a more fulfilling, better life. And what I've kind of ended up with is I just need to get by in the best way I can. I just need to get by. I'm struggling so much. The pain is so intense that I need to find a way that feels comfortable. And that way might not be the way that was taught to me. Does that make sense?
And you, Judith, I won't get into any specifics, but there are certain things I know that are prescribed to you as law that you've struggled with specifically more since the grief. Certain things where you're, again, I'm not the only person here who's not Jewish or religious, but I know there are certain holidays and times where you deliberately are suffering or fasting or choosing suffering for meaningful reasons. And I know you have sometimes felt like, am I not suffering enough?
Alina, you nailed it. And there are still times where I'm triggered by my faith. So I'm not triggered by God, but I'm triggered by the faith.
Where you walk into synagogue on Saturday and everyone is choosing suffering for the day, like it's a field trip to your life.
Talking about Tisha B'Av. Or just in general, when there's Simchat Torah, when there's a holiday that's really focused on kids, or Passover that's really focused on kids, where I find
the firstborn son
dying, all these other parts of it that are so triggering to me that it's I can't do a Passover Seder this year because that part is so triggering. So it's not God that I don't have any issue with God. Yeah. It's all this other stuff that comes with it. Rabbi, did that make sense? What are your thoughts as I say that? Where does that sit with you?
Well, I mean, the way I would think about it is, first of all, it very much resonates with me. And I really very much think that, Judaism is a structure, and not everything is going to work for every single person at every single time. And not every ritual and every mitzvah is going to work in that way, every commandment. And people have to prioritize their mental health and their stability and everything that they need in life they know what they need for themselves. And in these situations, even within the structure of Jewish law, there are so many leniencies to not be doing these things when it in fact causes you mental anguish. Like, for instance, like on Yom Kippur or whatever it is, if everyone is fasting, but this is not the topic of our conversation here, but let's say for people who have different eating disorders, there are many different legal writings around people who have eating disorders cannot fast, because if they fast, that they're trying to control their eating in a way that will be very dangerous for them, and then they can't do it. And mental health issues, we have a concept in Judaism, which is that the life takes priority over everything else, over all of the commandments, except for a few, but they don't come up. So the point is, life almost always takes priority. That's just the way it is. And it's not only our physical health and safety, it's also our mental health and safety is taken very, very seriously. So I definitely think that someone who is mourning or grieving, in the way that Judith, the way that you just described before, there would be many, many leniencies, even from within the perspective of the tradition, on what you wouldn't be obligated to do. And I do get questions like that from people somewhat regularly on different aspects of Jewish law. And so that's what I would say. But I would absolutely say, yes, you have to figure out what's right for you. That's from a legal perspective. From a more of a spiritual perspective, the way that I think about it is, that we have this word mitzvah, which means commandments, and it really feels like these are all the things that you have to do. It's maybe true, and this I grew up ultra orthodox, very very much with a philosophy that's way more restrictive than the approach that I take now, and I certainly grew up with that concept. But also an idea that I'm very much connected to is that the word mitzvah also has a different meaning in Aramaic and in Talmudic and Kabbalistic traditions, where it actually tzavta means connection, right? And the idea is that the mitzvot are ways that we are supposed to connect with God and connect with other people. We have 613 mitzvot. These are 613 opportunities for us to connect with God and with other people. And if one of those connections is actually making it harder, one of those mitzvot, then maybe for a certain time it should be put in a little box, and maybe we'll be able to get back to it at a later point. It's not what I teach when I get up in synagogue for everybody, because that's not the standard rule. But when it comes to people who are going through different things, that's definitely the case. And now that I'm talking about this, there should definitely be opportunities to, and maybe this is something that I need to work on a little better, is how can you communicate in more public settings some of these rules or leniencies for people in special situations or who are going through things? Because if they don't know that, then they wouldn't even know to ask that there could be certain ways. No,
I didn't. I had never been. I think like overnight I went from being a normal person to someone in a special situation. And I had no idea, I had no idea that I was in this new thing. It takes time, because the alternative is feeling guilt because you're like, I can't live up to what I was before. I feel that way in work too. Like my capacity is so much less, and I don't want to feel like I'm failing constantly because I cannot do what I could do before. I'm a different person now. So the standard has to change because my capacity is less.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But but I actually thought that was really helpful. Just you saying that now really resonated with me, and I appreciated that perspective. I don't think everyone takes that perspective, and I appreciate it so much because I think it's really understanding that life is not always so straightforward, and we're people and we go through different things. It can't be one way that fits all. So what you're saying is not one way that fits all, you know?
All right, that's it for this week's episode of As Long As I'm Living podcast. Check back next week for the continuation of our conversation with Rabbi Antine. Bye.
To all of our wonderful new friends, we want to hear from you. Email us at aslongasimlivingpodcast@gmail.com and follow us on Instagram at aslongasimlivingpodcast. We'll get back to you as soon as our grieving brains allow.
Yay!